It's my great pleasure to welcome you as the chair of the Australian Fashion Chamber, and also to introduce you to Sasha Sorokin from Net-a-Porter, and of course Dion Lee, who will be well known to you. Now, this seminar was actually born out of an idea that Sasha and I had a year ago. Sasha is an incredibly influential buyer for Net-a-Porter, and we had a discussion after our initial seminar launching the AFC about, I guess, some of the issues, but also some of the things that she was looking for as a buyer. And so at that time I said to her, you need to tell them that, not just me. And so she very kindly at that point committed to coming back here this season and hosting, or talking through this seminar. So first of all, a little bit of housekeeping. For anyone who's going to the Romance Was Born show, we have a bus that will be leaving at 8:45 to ensure that you can get to the art gallery on time, and I will be making sure that we take Q&A from about 8:30 so that no one will be late. So I guess now, first of all, this is going to be very casual. We're going to have, questions. Sasha will do a lot of the talking. Dion will hopefully do a little bit of talking as well. But Sasha will do a lot. But as I said, there will be an edited version of this available on the AFC website, and IMG will be podcasting it as well. So if you know other designers or people in the industry who you think would benefit from listening to this or reading it, please feel free to recommend it to them, and we'll be doing so on vogue.com.au as well. So I guess we're here to discuss the commercial v. the creative. It's obviously a position that challenges a lot of designers, but the reality is creativity is what we're all about in the fashion industry. We're always looking for the new, and we're inspired by creativity, and that's what we're all here for. But essentially, of course, you have to sell. Fashion is a commercial business. And so how these two things sit together and how you explore that as a designer and what is expected of you when a buyer comes to see your collection is really what the AFC is very passionate about helping with. So to start with, I guess let's talk about the designer v. brand discussion. How do you develop a brand whilst also having a true aesthetic that makes you an original and unique designer?
Absolutely. Well, I think the most important thing to identify as a designer from a buyer's standpoint is that a design, a collection, is one season. It's very seasonal, it's a point in time, it's a creative point in time, and that's very important to remember. A brand is seasonless. And that is the majority of what I really want to talk about today, because from a design standpoint, that seasonal emotion that designers have that I get to witness and that I see daily, I don't want to touch that from a creative standpoint because that's very precious. The brand standpoint and the work that a designer or your counterpart needs to do to really establish that brand is where there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of dry steps to be taken to really think through and get a structure behind what you're trying to tell a buyer. Because if I love a design, a collection, that doesn't necessarily mean that the brand is ready or structured or complete. So it's really it's a very important part of the process to make sure the designer thinks of the design, but is also considering the relationship between that season and the brand, and giving it the majority of the love, especially in the early days of your development, to the brand side. So,
and how do you see that sort of, I guess, fleshing out? So if we were looking at some successful examples, how have you seen that evolve over time successfully?
Well, I would say, for examples, the first one that jumps to mind is Zimmermann.
Yeah.
As we've discussed. So Zimmermann is, obviously we know the brand here incredibly well. It's internationally regarded as well, both for swim and for ready-to-wear. They've been in business for 23 years. But they've got their brand nailed. And that's something, I've had many discussions with them about it, and it's something that really they decided to establish a vision for. And that is probably the most important word I can say during this presentation. It's vision. And the vision of your brand is your North Star. Just always direct yourself there and make sure no matter what you do, no matter what season you're in, if it's a good season, bad season, successfully or, having challenges, it needs to be consistent in where you put your trust. And to get that North Star moment with yourself and with your team, there's a lot of work to get there. And that's the work that you really have to push yourself to do. A few thoughts about that. It's really all about fleshing out the questions that you would be asking yourself for what that vision is. You can phrase it as the who, what, where, when, why, how moment. Who's the customer? Where does she live? Very important question that comes up all the time, especially here. Is it Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere? Beyond the seasonality, what are the product needs? Is it Middle East where she needs a sleeve and some length? Is it APAC where suede doesn't work? APAC is in Asia. What really are the intricacies? Get to know her, or the group of hers. You can think of a dinner table. What do they need to be wearing? Why, how, etc. So really go through that process, and you cannot spend too much time on any of these questions. Really dig in, treat it like you're giving yourself your own curriculum. Do you have anything to add to that, Dion?
No,
Sorry.
no.
I'm already talking a lot.
No,
I promised I
But
wouldn't.
this was your question, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Dion's got the
I'm
next
gonna
one.
have my turn.
So another very important part of that little group is the why. Why your brand? Why do we need you in this world? How is it different? And really be tough on yourself. There's so many amazing, talented designers out there, and everyone is unique in their own way. But from a customer standpoint, why is he or she coming to you, remembering your name, remembering your collection, and your brand? So that would be where I would suggest a designer starts. I think it's all the better to bounce off these questions and ideas and really talk them through with a counterpart, whether it's your trusted business partner, your friends, mentors, consultants, an editorial individual, I'm obviously merchant individual, your other designers. Like, really hash it out and get into the emotion, but put yourself out there, not even externally, but just challenge yourself as to what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're going to do it. So once you've done all that work, I said it in about 2 minutes, but it actually takes a lot of time. And you can truly, hand on heart, say you've got your vision, you've fleshed it out, you've done the work. That then is your navigation. And any question that we as merchants or editorial teams could ask you, it's not for me to tell you if you need a sleeve or a long or a short or a commercial moment or not. You will have decided that you will have asked yourself that question and answered it for yourself. And then I can just have the fun job of seeing the collection and buying it.
And so, Dion, from your point of view, how does this sort of work as a designer when you're trying to, I guess, establish yourself as a brand? Is it with consistency of items that may be in collections, seasonally, or is it something else altogether?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's kind of, first and foremost, as Sasha said, really understanding where you sit in that landscape. In terms of other brands and other products as well, I think there's always the creative side of how you style the product, but really understanding what the customer's coming to you for, and having the opportunity to speak to that customer on a seasonal basis. So making sure they can come back to you and get the piece that they've got a previous season, while pushing them forward and continuing to further their understanding of your brand and push their identity of your product.
And do you think, this is something we certainly do in media when we talk about new products, and we ask ourselves the question of who is she and why does she need us in her life? Is it as simple as that? It's like understanding what the user, or from our point of view, what the customer wants, and making sure that you're delivering that. And then how do you also make sure that you are, as you say, moving her forward and being true to your own vision?
Yeah, I think it's, as you said, profiling the customer, understanding their lifestyle, what's relevant to them, why they're responding to what they're responding to. I think that's a big part of it, and the intuition of understanding what people want and what their drivers are. I think that plays a big part in it.
Intuition is a great word for that.
Yeah.
Because it has to come from there.
Yeah, and I think that's about, as you said, knowing your customer, but also knowing the people around you, seeing how people live their lives and what they respond to, how they want to dress, how they want to feel. I think that all plays a big part in it.
So, just, I guess, diverting slightly for a moment, something that I've noticed is when we do Reese's in Paris, for example, obviously McQueen, I think, is a great example. What you see on the runway, as we all know, sits on one rack down one side of the room, and then the other 6 racks, maybe, are the commercial pieces,
Exactly.
which are inspired by that collection, but which obviously we didn't see a single piece of on the runway, and are very different. They're very practical pieces. How do you, as a buyer, do you prefer to see a collection in a showroom presented that way, or more like, say, America Transu, where the ready-to-wear is kind of interspersed in amongst more commercial pieces?
On the runway?
No, in a showroom.
In a showroom. In a showroom, I would say I leave it to the brands to decide, because it's my job to suss it out. Even no brand does it the same, whether it's line sheets or business structure or collection structure. So in the McQueen example, it's such a small moment. I call it the iceberg situation, because you see a teeny tip, and that's what you see on the runway, the editorial moment, and then there's this massive thing below it, which you know is there, and you anticipate it, and they do it quite well. And that's the commercial meat of what we're seeing. Within a showroom, I think McQueen, I love that they keep it consistent, because they're not trying to make it something it's not. So they know that they're not producing it. We know that they're not producing it. But the brand has just put its stake in the sand as a brand that dreams, and is one of the few houses that really does so to that degree while being a ready-to-wear business as opposed to purely couture. Yeah.
So I guess now moving to the subject of merchandising, how do you feel a designer needs to move with merchandising, staying consistent with their brand vision?
Yes. I think that's where I'm going to be like the bad cop and all of this. And be like, there's a lot of work in all
That's
of
all right,
this.
you're allowed to.
So the merchandising factor, to me, is all about really getting, I call it a body check. So it's your categories. And by categories, I mean the skirts, the pants, the shorts, the dresses, the knitwear, the tailoring, what kind of tailoring, blazers, etc. You can do the same thing in any non-apparel category. I do the same thing with my jewelry designers. And making sure that you have enough there. And once you have exhausted all of those things, and I oftentimes do a grid with the designers that I work with. I put shape across the top and story along the side equals a grid, and you want to fill in all the boxes. It's actually quite fun and pretty straightforward.
So how does that work? Just explain that a little bit more.
You would have the shape of the piece, so you'd have your skirts, your pants, your etc. along the top, and then I call it stories, but your motifs along rows, so think columns plus rows. And if we're doing if we're thinking of like there's a frill moment, there's a fringe moment, there's a this and that, and you want to design pieces around, you want to make sure you have a fringe dress, a fringe top, etc. It pushes the designer to really think of all of the shapes that could be in that particular motif. And after you've done all of that and filled in all the boxes, then you can slash the ones that you don't think are relevant. So you don't need to actually design all these pieces, but consider each moment, and you'll start to come up with things that you wouldn't have really pushed yourself to think of in the process. I work with a lot of amazingly talented designers, and what I do notice is that you all, or however many of you in here are designers, will move on more quickly than I necessarily want you to move on. So if you know that, and if someone is telling you you need to keep this in the collection because it's a bestseller, you may want to give it a second thought and to listen to them, but also to go through that process of making sure you've really fleshed out a story that you may have been satisfied with, and really pull out a few more pieces, because you never know what is lying behind a little bit of extra work in a story.
Yeah.
So from your point of view, Dion, if you're, I guess, coming up with a collection or a concept, do you start with big idea and then plug this in
definitely.
underneath? Or?
I think the concept about the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, you kind of use that to inform the commerciality within the collection. It's kind of the starting point for how you flesh out the rest of the categories in a collection. Using something that might be quite experimental, but then looking at how you can tone that down and allow the profile or the silhouette of the shape to lead rather than the textile or the technique, I suppose. So I think it's in some pieces the idea is more dominant, and in some pieces the end use is more dominant. But yeah, it's kind of about making sure that there's a scope from one end to the other.
Because I suppose that's something that we haven't been very good at in terms of telling that story in media, because I'm often asked, why are none of the things that you shoot available, for example, or why are they so expensive?
Yeah.
And it's usually because we're only dealing with the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
So we're translating, and because you're working in high fashion and dealing with ready-to-wear collections and putting ready-to-wear next to ready-to-wear, you are basically not dealing with commercial collections when you deal with editorial samples. You're dealing with what's seen on the runway.
Yeah.
So do you think that that's something that we perhaps have missed a little bit in Australian fashion in general, kind of explaining that difference, or is it?
I think so, to some extent. I mean, as Sasha said, even with our collections, our runway collection is a very small part of that. I think being an Australian designer, our Australian audience is quite different to our international audience. I think it's something that, as a business, we're still very much working out how you support both, because it is really important that your ideas are getting the editorial, but at the same time, it's really important that the commercial ideas are being supported.
And what is the difference, interestingly, between your profile internationally, customer profile, and locally?
I think it's much broader here. So I think that comes from the market being smaller at the top end. So it means that our commercial product needs to have a lower entry price. There is more of a focus on lifestyle. So obviously we have a second line, line 2, which really helps build out the scope of the brand that if we were just really presenting the runway collections, that wouldn't allow. We have 3 retail stores now in Australia, and that's had a big impact on how we shape collections and really put the customer's feedback back into the following season. So I think with the runway or the iceberg, it doesn't need to be as led by that, but the rest of the collection really, really does. It's about using information and, as much data that you can kind of get your hands on to really understand who your customer is and make sure you're able to grow the options for her on a seasonal basis.
So Sasha, from your point of view, how do you balance that commercial with creative? I mean, how does a designer, you obviously need to see both.
Yes.
But when it's done well, what does it look like, I suppose?
When it's done well, first of all, the Net-a-Porter, the company that I work for, we buy more of the editorial on the runway than your average store, I would think. It just happens to be our business model. And we get to have a lot of fun with it and then support a lot of that product, the tip of the iceberg, that may not be bought as much by many retailers. So my experience in the relationship is probably a bit more skewed to editorial and in making sure we cover that as well. But from a commercial standpoint and making sure I can grow the actual business that I'm giving to the designer, it's making sure that if there is an amazing piece, I just had this experience with the Ellery team. There was a gorgeous, very thick Italian wool rawhide trench coat in the showroom. I was like, oh, it's amazing. I love this one. She's like, oh, it's 5,000. I was like, excuse me? And before I could say, well, where's the commercial option? She was like, here's the commercial option. So that consideration is very important. And it doesn't mean you need to have a commercial option for everything, but if you want it to get love from your customer, and if you really want to make sure someone who's not, at the very tip of the iceberg, and they exist, so keep producing them, but if you want to have more volume and trust from the buying side, consider that. The commercial little sibling to the hero piece. I mean, this is the jargon that I generally use in showrooms.
And so as an international buyer coming to this event, what are you looking for? Why are you here?
Talent, in a word. And what does that... There's talent, but talent can, someone is talented their entire lives. And then I would say talent within a point in time. And then most importantly, the brand factor of that talented person. And within someone's personal trajectory, they really need to hit on the point of being consistent and authentic. Authenticity is hugely important. And I won't belabor the whole brand vision thing, but I would relate that, that again to the authenticity factor. But it's really making sure that you have established and you trust your own voice and your own creative presentation to me. And of course then, thereafter, it's the importance of making sure that production is in line. I mean, it is a business. So if I place an order on behalf of Net-a-Porter, it has to be something that I know will be delivered. The quality will be buttoned up, no pun intended. And that next season, the brand will still be on that same trajectory.
And how many collections will you often look at, or how many times will you
Before placing?
consider a designer before placing? Yeah.
It varies. It absolutely varies. It depends on the category. So, so jewelry happens to be easier to pick up in a moment because it's much more micro-trend led. A ready-to-wear designer, I would want to see, generally, I would track them for a few seasons and then pick them up if I saw consistency and authenticity and the guts of the business as there. But there's no formula. I've picked up brands, first season site, on site, had committed to it and have gone for it. And there are other brands where we've been, talking for many seasons before we get into bed. So, yeah.
Before we get into bed, I love that.
Lots of dancing before you go to bed.
And now we've heard from other designers that they're buying the majority now of their stock, I suppose, in resort and pre-fall collections. Is that true of
Absolutely,
Net-a-Porter?
yes. And because we are a particularly runway-led company, we generally like 70% of the season in pre-collection. And that's with us being a runway brand, so a runway retailer. So it's hugely important to give all of your attention and love, not all of it, but as much as you would to runway, to the pre-collection, because that is how you're going to build your business. There's more time on the sales floor of the product, hugely important. The product is generally less risky and expensive from the production standpoint with embellishment if you're doing it or things like this. You can have the breadth of commercial options there because that's where the customer is coming into the shop or online throughout the season looking for that simple black pair of pants, for example. But once the runway deliveries start coming in, they've ticked that box. So it's very important, hugely important to be able to have a very meaty pre-collection. And as a benchmark, I would say 70-30 between the season.
70-30,
yeah,
right.
between the deliveries for the season.
And Dion, how do you then balance, obviously one of the challenges of being Australian-based is balancing the international with the local and the seasonality. How do you do it?
There was a period where we were kind of transitioning, but we're very much in the Northern Hemisphere seasons now. I mean, the only season that I have a real problem with is the international fall-winter, which is our domestic spring-summer. That's always the one that's more challenging, and consequently it just becomes a bigger collection because you need options that are really relevant to both hemispheres. Resort works internationally perfectly. It's kind of the best season for crossover.
It's where we cross over.
Yeah, exactly. And then pre-fall works, the timing of that is great. Drops May, June, which is when it's cold in Australia, so that really works as well. And then the international spring-summer ends up becoming a light Australian autumn-winter. We often add in a coat or a piece, but I think the heavier pieces, the knitwear and the coating, is better positioned in pre-fall because it's dropping earlier on for our climate. But yeah, I think there's advantages of Australia being we don't have super cold winters, so I think there's an advantage there. I think every collection should be really approached with the concept of trans-seasonality, especially with so many online retailers. It's really broken down the barriers of a season is a season. I think there's still the perception of seasons, which are really important, and you really notice that in the Northern Hemisphere, how it drives change, you know, out with the old, in with the new each season. And sometimes I think that's a bit of a disadvantage in Australia. We don't have that, oh my God, it's just gotten really cold, I need to buy this. Where it's kind of rolling, and our seasons blend together a little bit more.
I can't emphasize enough how much I agree with Dion. I think there's no, as a buyer, I would never think that the collection's over-sorted if you have wear now and wear later, and if you're making a consideration for both hemispheres. And in my time here last year, that was what I'd noticed most of all, and I've seen an improvement, which is wonderful. But
Where have you seen the improvement?
in just having conversations, I mean, we did it in Dion's show, and we were talking about that puffer coat.
Love that stuff.
It's gorgeous puffer coat.
Yeah.
And
Not for Australia.
no,
Not for Australia.
but I'm from LA, and they would wear that in LA because that would
Yeah.
be their, like, you know, their 50-degree weather coat.
Yeah.
But I said, well, you know, by all means, put that in the cruise collection.
Yeah.
Because Northern Hemisphere, I'm always asking brands for more wear now moments, and pre-spring resort, it's going to live on the floor until it goes on sale in summertime. So most designers think, okay, that's spring, like let's get lightweight fabric. It's shipping in October. Like it's just getting cold. So my entire company has really been pushing for the wear now factor to be offered as well.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to figure out how much of it we should buy, but we want to be able to buy the product, which means you have to offer the product. So a puffer coat like that, I wouldn't be concerned if I saw it in a cruise delivery, because I would know that we're thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's very important, and that's even within, you know, just one climate consideration. You have the added advantage of having, you know, multiple hemispheres to consider, so that will be pushing you to do the work as well.
Yeah, it's always winter somewhere, it's always summer somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is
Exactly.
actually, that's an online retailing
Yeah,
has actually changed
exactly,
the landscape,
yeah.
I think, for
It's made
Australian
it
designers.
less precious, I suppose, in that capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we are starting to see that, I think, even more on the Northern Hemisphere runways, I think, where it's becoming a little bit trans-seasonal.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like this autumn-winter didn't really feel
No.
like autumn-winter.
No,
Exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the color palette of last autumn, or the pastels, felt very springy. So it's shifting a bit.
So I should probably throw to the floor now. Does anyone have any questions? I mean, we could probably talk forever, and I'm sure some of those things sound, yes.
Just with. Hello? Is this on? Hello? No. Sorry. Okay. Just with what you said about the commercial factor in the collections, I know a lot of like new designers, especially I'm originally from Canberra, so there's a kind of a fledgling little industry over there. And they've also got their own fashion week as well. And there's some designers who are just starting to put their stuff on the runway there. But you notice that obviously they don't have the capacity to produce, you know, a commercial collection. So they're kind of trying to combine their collection, like it's just immediately commercial. But it's such a high price point because of the production that goes into, you know, they're sewing it by hand and the fabrics are very expensive. So I feel like they're getting their stuff on the runway, but then not being able to sell it just because of the price point. Do you have any comments about how a designer who doesn't really have that much capital can, you know, is there some strategy they can employ to get, you know, to get their things commercial faster so that they can start supporting and growing their brand?
Well, I'll take this from the buyer standpoint, but I actually think it's a very interesting question for design as well.
Yeah.
I would say it's a chicken or egg question ultimately. Do you produce what will sell to build it up, or do you and try to make profit as soon as possible, or do you accept that you won't have profit to make sales, and then start building from there? There are quite a few production considerations on making a margin internally as a designer. Of course, the retailer wants the margin and the customer wants a fair retail price. Intuitively, I would say, if possible, take the hit on making a profit early days to get momentum behind the brand, because that's the momentum is very important. very few brands, from what I understand, make profit early years. And it's about getting backing, it's about getting traction with the customer and getting sales to roll. So once you hit those minimums in production, that's when your margin starts building. So from a production standpoint, that'd be my feedback. From a collection standpoint, I generally want to see, in earliest days of a brand, I want to see what their creative vision is. So the editorial creative factor is hugely important, and I wouldn't want them to sacrifice that. Because with the due work that they would need to be doing to get that brand vision and getting the great counterpart to be left brain, right brain balance, that I would trust, hopefully I would be seeing that would start to develop, even if it's through a conversation. I have these conversations all the time in showrooms of, put this balance in there, so.
And Dion, do you think runway shows are an absolutely necessary part of establishing that vision?
No, I don't think so. The interesting point in regards to that idea of commercial versus creative, I really believe that they should be really integrated. I think that it's really challenging to design commercial clothes, and I know that when I was starting out, it was really about clothes that were really creative, but that were still relevant and that were still commercial. I think that that's the challenge for any designer is in that situation is to design something that's amazing and creative, but that some people still really want to wear. I think that's kind of the way to overcome that. And yeah, still be relevant to your customer, but excite them at the same time.
And so the runway show factor, because obviously it's very expensive to show.
I don't think it's fundamental to building a business in any regard. And I think as a young designer, you do kind of feel that that's the obvious pathway, and it helps a lot. But I think that I don't know. I think that good product really can't be ignored in this world, and ultimately it's so much easier to communicate now and get your message out than it was even 5 years ago when I was starting my brand. So if you're doing something amazing, it's very hard to hide that in this world.
That is what has changed, isn't it, in the landscape? That social media factor now can be as powerful as a runway show. Really.
Yeah, definitely.
It's much more democratic.
Yeah, and those moments live on, I think that, runway moments are really for people in the room, but it's really what comes out of that, the media, that is really having the biggest impact.
Do we have other questions?
I'm in the fashion tech space. What's your opinion on different online shopping and fashion discovery apps for designers to leverage sales, and is there any that stand out for you in Australia and internationally?
Fashion discovery apps.
Online shopping apps.
Online shopping apps. Do you mean other retailers or like a shop style?
Yeah, like shop style.
I'm sure they have a lot of functionality. For me personally, and they need to be there. I was just having a chat with Simon Locke yesterday about his new project, which is basically an online showroom. Not to simplify it if he's in the room. Ultimately, I think the question you're asking is, how do we find new designers? Ish.
An online shopping app could be a platform for different designers or retailers to leverage on each other.
Absolutely. I think the most important thing when it comes to apps and tech startups is that it hits critical mass, because I won't be going to many different ones. So until it has that Google moment of it's the hero that does that, then I would absolutely imagine a huge function for it in my job. But we haven't arrived at that single brand that does the hero function of showing me new designers. I'm sure it will come, and I absolutely see the relevance for it. For me, that's still style.com, but I don't peruse new brands on style.com. I use it as a resource to see the shows that I haven't been able to see in person. But I would love, if I were imagining that type of app, I would love to have it. And to click into Shanghai and to click into Sydney if I couldn't make this week. But even to be able to have that resource during this week because I haven't seen every show. And to get a full picture and then to be able to email it back to my team, have discussions with them, I mean, all of those things should fully exist.
Any other questions? Is there anything that you would like to add, do you think? We've got another 3 minutes
3
to
minutes.
stay on our schedule.
I would say, well, first of all, it's been an amazing week, and last year was really a process for me personally of getting a lay of the land and getting a sense of what Sydney Fashion Week is all about. And I've been very impressed at the next experience that I've had, because I have seen move on from the seasonality factor, from more concise shows. We didn't happen to hit on that, but I would also say as you know, as feedback, to some of the shows that I've seen in the breadth of shows, keep an edit on the runway. I trust you've got the commercial there. I don't want to see it on the runway. I want to see that iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. So I know there's a lot of mono-brand retail here, which is great because that pushes brands to think in the way that we've been discussing today. But if you're doing a runway, keep it concise, keep it to one vision. I mean, you absolutely do it, Dion. Michael Assordo did a perfect job of it. He just had one vision, and it was quite clean and really emotional. And yeah, that would be my big feedback.
What role, just one last question, then does a stylist play in terms of working as a designer and what you decide?
Yeah,
goes
I
on
think
the
they're
runway?
really translating how you communicate a collection and really putting that into a language that is relevant and that people understand. Yeah, it's about choosing the most relevant ideas and the newest ideas and the ideas that work together on a runway. Yeah.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'll finish with that. Sasha, thank you so much.
Thank
I
you for
hope
having
that
me.
was insightful, and thank you,
Thank
Dion.
you.